Wonderful. Thanks, Marilyn. So my grandma did come from Ireland, so I raised my hand there. And then her father was from Scotland, so I raised my hand there. But I don't think I count at all. My parents were Canadian. This is a story, a Scottish story. It comes from the Highlands. It was collected by Saoirse Nick Lewis, and she collected it in the late 1950s, and it's adapted from her story, The Lass Who Was Never Frighted. So there was a young woman who lived up in the Highlands in a small cottage that was right on the edge of a deep woods. And when she was a little girl, her mother died, and she left her with her name. She called her Jeanie, and this song: sing high, Jeanie, high, sing low, Jeanie, low, you'll never make a singing bird out of the hoodie crows. And that was it. And her father, he was useless to her while she was growing up. And he just got vaguer and vaguer, and eventually he just wandered off. And when they were all sure that he was never coming back, the kind people in the village, they asked Jeanie to come move closer down where they were so it would be safer. Why should I? Well, aren't you afraid being right next to the deep woods? I am not afraid of anything in that woods. There's nothing bigger than a deer, and there's nothing more fierce than a badger. And, well, there isn't anything that my trusty Jack, our dog, that my trusty Jack and I couldn't handle. They crept in a little closer and they said, what about the wee folk? But she laughed. She said, the ghastly goblins or the ghoulies, I am not afraid of those. Are you saying you don't believe in the fairy? Well, she wouldn't say that, but she didn't deny it either. And so that's when the rumor started that she was a lass who was never frightened. Well, as things went on, she was leading a comfortable life there in the little cottage by the woods until one day she was out in the garden, and a couple of lads from the village came by and they noticed her. They noticed her a lot. And one of them said to the other, you know, our Jeanie, she's the bonniest lass anywhere in the whole county. And the two of them ran into the village and they gathered all the young lads, all the single lads together. And they said, have you noticed that Jeanie is the bonniest lass anywhere in the county? And they said, oh, she is, you're right. And so they all decided she was of marriageable age. They should all march right up there and have her choose. And so they all got dressed in their Sunday best, their black jackets, and some of them had black vests, and a few of them even had black hats. And they all the young men from miles and miles around, they marched all the way up to that lane that went out to the woods, out to Jeanie's cottage. Well, all but one. Our man Wren, the weaver's son. He said, Wren, aren't you coming? And he said, no. He said, haven't you noticed she's the bonniest girl? He said, oh, I noticed that a long time ago. Well, why aren't you coming? She might choose you for her husband. And he said, I don't think the time is right. And so when all the other young men marched up there to go to her door, he didn't get dressed in his Sunday best. But he did decide right then that he might need to go to the wood to gather some kindling. And so he stayed on the other side of the hedge, but he kept one eye and an ear on what was going on over there in Jeanie's cottage. And the young men, they all gathered in a big circle, and the biggest of them knocked on her door, and she opened the door, and she said, what is all this then? What is going on? You all look like a big circle of crows all dressed in black. And she said, what do you want? And they said, well, Jeanie, We know you're of marriageable age, and we all think that it would be a fine thing to be your husband. We want you to choose." And she said, "What would I be needing a husband for?" Well, they were a little taken aback, but the one who knocked, he was pretty bold. He said, "Well, don't you need someone to fend for you? You're living out here at the edge of the wood." And she said, "There is nothing in that wood, I've said it before, I'll say it again, that I would ever be afraid of, as long as I've got my trusty Jack." And they said, "Well, one of the ones who was a little more prosperous, the butcher's son, he said, 'Well, maybe you'd marry for money.'" And she said, "What do I need money for? I have everything I need right here, and if I can't grow it or make it, I've got the coo and the hens. I can sell a little milk or eggs to get what I can't make or grow." And one of the sweet young lads in the back, he said, "Maybe you'd marry for love." And she looked around, she smiled at him, and she looked at all of the faces of the young men. She didn't seem to see the one she was looking for. And maybe she glanced over the hedge and looked a little longer at our man Wren. But he was looking down at the ground, studying it like there was an exam. And when he did look up and caught her eye, he turned and ran into the woods to get that kindling. And she said, "Oh, well, if I find someone I could care for, I'll consider it. But you all go away." And she sang them out with her song. "Sing high, Jeannie, high. Sing low, Jeannie, low. You'll never make a singing bird out of the hoodie crows." And they all ran. And Jeannie, she continued living her comfortable life there in the cottage until one night she was making her oatmeal. And she was scraping out the bin to get the last of the meal. And she was eating her dinner, and she realized, she wouldn't have any meal to make oatcakes in the morning for breakfast. And she really wanted oatcakes in the morning for breakfast. Thought, well, there's nothing to it. I'll have to go to the miller. And so she scooped up grain into her bag, and she hauled it on down to the mill house, and it was all locked up tight. And so was the miller's house next door, completely dark and locked up tight. He must have gone away visiting or something with his whole family. So she sat down to have herself a think. She really wanted those oatcakes in the morning. There was nothing for it. She'd have to go to the mill that was over the hill and into the next village, and almost over to the next one after that. Lockie's mill. So she started out. Now, when she had gotten to the first mill, it was almost sunset, and so as she was walking, it was getting darker and darker. But she said to herself, "Well, I'm not afraid of the dark." and so she walked up over the hills, and she got to Lockie's mill, and it was locked up, but it didn't worry her because the house next door was all lit up. It was clearly home. And so she knocked on the door, and Lockie opened the door, and he said, "Go away." And she said, "Oh, now listen, I just have a little bit of grain. I want to have it ground for meal so that I can have my oatcakes in the morning. I'm determined to have them for breakfast." And he said, "Go away. There will be no milling in that house tonight." And she said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Well, every time anyone gets that mill wheel running after dark, a goblin comes up from the floorboards and hits them on the head with a great big black club." Well, she laughed just like you did. She said, "Oh, really? Well, I am not afraid. How about you give me the key, and I will go and mill my own meal." And Lockie, he said, "I will not. I will not." But she was a very persistent girl. And so at last he said, "Well, I'm going to call my wife and everyone in the house to have witness, because I will not have your neck on my head." And so he called his wife, and she gave the lass a lantern, and he said, "You can see, I did not want her to do this. This is of her own." And she went into the mill. She unlocked it and she lifted up the sluice gate so that the water would start running in, and the wheel went around, clackety, 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 clack. And she poured the grain into the hopper, and it went down between the grinding stones. You all know how a mill works. Sometimes I have to explain it to people, but I know that you all know. And they were grinding. It was no time at all before that little bit of grain was ground into a very fine meal. And she opened the hopper and filled up her bag and tied it up tight. And she thought, well, that was nothing. She was just about to put the sluice gate back down when up from the floorboards came a great green goblin with terrible teeth, holding a huge black club. And she turned to face him, and he looked at her, and, well, that goblin had hit many a man at night at that mill house, but he'd never before seen a maid in there. And goblins, they're not too quick when it comes to something new. So he wasn't quite sure what to do with her. He was sort of taken aback, and he leaned back and took a step, and our Jeannie, she took advantage of that, and she grabbed that big black club and she whacked him right across the head. And well, it was a terrible pain. You can't kill a goblin, but it hurt. And so he started to run, and she started to chase him, and she was whacking him about the head and shoulders, and whenever she missed, she might hit the wall, bang. And it was making a terrible, terrible clatter, and around and around and around they ran, until at last the goblin saw a great big oaken piece of wood next to the hopper that Lockie would use whenever there was a large load of grain to push down. And when the goblin saw that, well, he turned just for a second to pick up the wood to hit this terror. But as soon as he turned his back, our Jeannie came in close to him, put her foot right on his backside, and boom, knocked him right head first down the hopper. Well, and around and around and around he went between those grindstones. And you can't kill a goblin, but he was in mortal pain. And so he was howling, oh, stop, please, let me out. I promise, if you just let me out, I will go away and I'll never bother you again. Well, our Jeannie, she was mopping her brow and the back of her neck because it had been quite a chase around the mill house. She said, well, as long as you promise. Put that gate down, and she reached into the hopper, and she brought that goblin out by the nape of his neck. Ooh, you never saw such a sorry sight in your life. And she shook him just a little, but he had no fight left in him. He took his big black club and put it under his arm and used it as a hobbling stick to go right out the door. Well, Jeannie, she locked up the mill house. She went back to Lockie's door, and she banged on it for quite a while. And when he finally got the nerve up to creak open the door, he saw her there, and she handed him the key. She said, I locked up your mill house, and I got rid of your goblin problem as well. And off she went. I have to tell you, she had never enjoyed a breakfast as much as those oatcakes the next morning. But Lockie, he could not wait to tell that story. The next morning he got up early and started all around the county. And it was at the blacksmith shop down at the village that our man Wren heard the story. And his heart, it broke. He had always thought this lass who wasn't afraid, who wasn't frightened, that was all just talk. But now with this story, there seemed to be proof. He had always thought maybe she would sometimes need a man to fend for her, and he would have liked to be that man. And he was crying and telling his mother all about this, his tears, big manly tears going into his tea. And his mother said, there. When he pulled himself together, she said, well, you never know. Tomorrow, I'm going to need some kindling. Will you go into the woods to get it for me? And he was a good son. He said he would. And when he left his mother's house, his mom went out for an errand of her own. And the next day, just as he had promised, he was headed down the lane to the wood to get kindling for his ma, and he went right by Jeannie's door. And I tell you, when he went by that cottage, he heard the most awful racket. Help! Someone help! Please! open, and there Jeannie was on the table with her skirts wrapped around her knees, screaming to high heaven, "Help me, save me, help me, save me!" And there was a beast next to the table. Well, down on the floor. It was a wee little beastie, like Robbie Burns had written about. A wee little mouse next to the table on the floor. Well, he very carefully didn't laugh and ran and got the broom from next to the hearth, and he pushed that mouse out the door, and no sooner had he slammed the door behind the mouse than Jeannie threw herself into his arms. "Oh, thank you for saving me, thank you." He said, "Well, who would have ever thought the lass who was never frightened would be scared of a wee brown mousie?" And she said, "Well, I never said I was never frightened, but my trusty Jack is off in the woods somewhere, and, well, it's a good thing you came along when you did." And she nestled her head right there on his shoulder. The two young people stood like that for a bit. And then our man Wren, he said, "I reckon we'll marry on Sunday." And Jeannie, she said, "Aye." And they were. And it wasn't but a week after that the groom's mother came to see her new daughter-in-law, while her son was out looking after the sheep or some such. "Oh, mother, come in. Have some tea and some fresh oatcakes. I've been meaning to thank you for taking my dog, Trusty Jack, for a walk in the woods about a week ago." And his mother said, "Well, and wasn't it a good thing that my Wren just happened along at the right time?" And the two women burst into laughter and then into song. "Sing high, Jeannie, high. Sing low, Jeannie, low. You'll never make a singing bird out of the hoodie crow."